get past the door and pay. No, anyone sneaked in? No, good. I'm just killing a couple of minutes on purpose because I've got a couple of people coming in hopefully the next couple of minutes. So,
Give us a song.
Which one would you like? No, we usually welcome people from near and far, and we have a guest here this evening from London. It's the back there, who read about Tony and his theories about this fellow Oliver Cromwell, possibly the greatest Briton, as Tony will no doubt persuade us. He's not saying anything. And yes, this correspondence appeared in the Times, no less. And Liam spotted it and thought, right, I must hear more about this, and so he's here. So a very good, special welcome to Liam. Has anybody else come from distant parts?
Yeah, Southsea.
Ailing Island.
Well, the last lecture, if you remember, we had a chap who just flown in from the Caribbean. So, you know, we're in such demand. This person hasn't arrived yet. I think I'm going to have to bite the bullet and welcome Tony for, I think, his 11th appearance here in this lecture series since it began in 1999. So he's been the most prolific contributor, and we always look forward to your talks, don't we?
I hope so.
We do very much, and I have heard this talk almost all the way through over a couple of pints. Or probably more than a couple of pints actually, but anyway. So without more ado, I'll hand you over to Tony, Professor Tony Thornton.
It's nice to be back, and as I often say, what's especially nice is to see there's people in the audience who have heard me talk before. So this talk, oddly, Tony said he was going to call it Cromwell Good or Bad, question mark, but then he gave up and he used my title, The Demonisation of Oliver Cromwell. That picture is the statue outside Parliament, outside the houses of the institution which he basically formed, or at least its method of operation was formed by him. I will not spend a lot of time talking about how good he was, because in fact if it weren't for him, things might be very different. But I will remind you what normally happens in revolutions, where factions then fight amongst themselves, as is happening in Syria at the moment, where people are much more interested in who is going to take over by non-democratic means than getting things sorted out. Russia still hasn't got over its revolution. France really hasn't got over its revolution. Spain, the effects of the Spanish Civil War are still echo around. Somebody was put in prison the other day for saying something about it which they didn't like, and he was in prison. He was soon let out because the other people did like what he said. But this is the way it goes, and it is interesting what Antonia Fraser wrote in her biography of Dickens called Our Chief of Men, and she was really no automatic friend of Cromwell's. She was a Catholic and she was a royalist, and a lot of, she puts in her book a lot of the things against him. But she does write, we can only hazard a guess as to the nature of the violent convulsions which might have shaken Britain's structure later, had the gentler turnabout of the civil wars, ending in Oliver's restorative rule, not intervened. Basically, he held the ring when everything else would have fallen to bits. And by doing that, he held the ring, and it isn't recognised, but it seems perfectly clear he was hoping that when he died, there would be a constitutional monarchy, because he didn't appoint a successor, He did nothing to impede the reappointment of Charles II there. And the other thing I would read you is another man who was an automatic anti-Cromwell man, and that was the Earl of Cavendish, who was Charles II's Chancellor and father-in-law to James II. He wrote a piece about Cromwell which actually spelled him out the status of the man. He said, "With so little pains, this extraordinary man," not a term you would expect somebody to use about Cromwell perhaps, "this extraordinary man, without the assistance and against the wish of all noble persons, or men of quality, and without any but 3 men who in the beginning of the troubles were possessed of £300 of land per year, he mounted himself into the throne of the 3 kingdoms, without the name of king, but with greater power and authority than had ever been exercised or claimed by any king." And then he goes on to explain why Cromwell was able to do this. Cromwell proceeds with strange dexterity towards reconciling all sorts of persons, and chooses those out of all parties whose abilities are most eminent. Doesn't that give you a funny feeling when you look at our politicians today? And then he added, his glory at home was though but a shadow of the glory that he had abroad. This was a man who was really something special, and it's very difficult to believe that he is liable, that his character is blackened by so many people, and it seems that it is done, nobody knows what to do about it, nobody does the research to find out why this happened. But when I say demonised, what I mean is that his character has been so blackened that people can say things about him which are quite untrue, and nobody challenges them, because that's what you know about Cromwell. He was not a good man. Now, I was trying to think, first time I did this lecture, how to get over to people without just making a big statement of it, what happened to him. And I looked along my bookshelves, I've got a lot of bookshelves, and I picked out 6 books, not entirely at random, but ones that I thought might have something about Cromwell in them, whatever they were. The first one was Who's Who in British History, published by the Historical Association, and you would expect here that we're going to have something which is extremely reliable there. So, what do we find? Cromwell was the first chairman of the Council of State set up by the Rump Parliament on the 17th of February 1649, just after the King's death. No, he wasn't. The first chairman of the Council of State was a Judge John Hayward. He was also instrumental in confronting and ruthlessly suppressing Leveller leadership in the army. Well, he was instrumental, but he wasn't the leader of the army. And then it goes on, he superintended the trial of Charles I. No, he didn't. That was done by 5 judges. And then he said he superintended the execution of Charles I. No, he didn't. He wasn't even there. At the execution, it was in charge of the captain of guards, and Cromwell, all we know is that he wasn't there, but he said afterwards he had been contemplating the fact of this sad necessity that the king could not live if England was to be in peace. So that's just a history book which has just a paragraph, 3 wrong statements designed to put Cromwell as though he was an all-powerful man doing everything. And then I went to something quite different, quite a little book, and it's written by Dennis Wheatley. Dennis Wheatley is best known for stories such as The Devil Rides Out, which was made into a film with Christopher Lee. Now, this story is called Old Rowley. Old Rowley being Charles II's favourite stud horse. And it was the nickname given to Charles II because he seemed to be many people's favourite stud. And in this book, which is quite frivolous in general, he manages to find room to put in something about Cromwell. The Civil War in England had been remarkably free from the partisan acts of barbarity, which make such terrible reading in those annals concerning the internecine strife of other nations. Absolutely true. In Ireland, however, it was a very different matter. From the time of the massacre at Drogheda in September until the following spring, Cromwell marched through the land, hanging, burning and slaughtering with an incredible ferocity. He manages to work that in. Now the truth is that that piece, those words were written by a group of Catholic bishops, Irish Catholic bishops about him. And it was written to show what a terrible man, what a terrible man Cromwell was. He replied with a public letter which said, I defy you to name one person who has suffered at the hands of my army, has been killed, injured or banished, who was not under arms or in the office of the army of the rebels. He had made that challenge. Name somebody. That letter has never been answered then or since. Nobody has named a person who was armed by Oliver Cromwell. You hear of things happening, but there's no plaques for people in memoriam, nothing there that is actually genuine. It was put in, only things which were put in later. And then I picked up another book, which is not one, I don't know what it was doing on the shelves, but a book of royal days, where every day in the year, 1st of January, this man had found something that had happened where a royal event had occurred. On 2 occasions, having no royal event, or feeling that Cromwell was near enough to go in, the 13th of April 1951, was what he was writing about was the stealing of the stone of Scone out of Westminster Abbey by a group of Scotch students who took it because they thought it belonged where it was taken from by Edward I up in Scotland. So then he said the only time he'd ever left Westminster until the students speeched it in 1950 was when Oliver Cromwell had it taken to Westminster Hall for his inauguration as Lord Protector. So I checked with the annals of Westminster Abbey because I know that Cromwell had no wishes to be king, and you find the only time that it went was when those students took it, and it never went out at any other time. It's just something to make it sound that Cromwell was after engrandishment. But what people wrote about him was that no man in his position had less aggrandised himself or enriched his family than Oliver Cromwell did. Oddly, the other day I came across something on the website which said Cromwell was paid £30,000 a year. In today's money that would be £6 million a year. And I thought, where on earth has that come from? It doesn't fit anything that you've read. So I checked the references, and the reference to that was a children's Ladybird book. And then he has a second one at the second inauguration of Cromwell, when he said, dressed in purple velvet, edged and lined with ermine, Cromwell was led to the coronation chair which had been removed from Westminster Abbey for the occasion. In front of this was a table upon which had been placed the Bible, sword and sceptre. Then sitting alone he swore to rule upon the basis, etc., etc., etc. Basically as a king. Now, the bit about the dressed in ermine, etc., came from a royalist pamphlet. And there's a picture from the royalist pamphlet in Antonia Fraser's book. She doesn't mention that it was a royalist propaganda pamphlet. She just puts it in and quotes it. Here's Oliver Cromwell, bless his heart. There. There he is, in his ermine and purple and everything. Which is really odd, because you find letters, you find statements by people, complaints about Oliver Cromwell's inauguration, that he did not dress suitably to the occasion, but walked to Westminster Hall in a plain black suit. Where it doesn't Antonia Fraser have any books and references to look at? Well, it doesn't matter really, because you can say that and everybody will believe it. She doesn't tell you that that's where that came from, and went straight into this Book of Days. And there it says the coronation chair. So I looked in the annals of Westminster Abbey, and it says the coronation chair has never left at Westminster Abbey since it was put there originally. So this is the sort of problem that one deals with when you're dealing with Oliver Cromwell. And then I picked up a very odd book, the National Trust Guide. National Trust Guide, because as I've gone round the country, you very often go to the state homes as a member, and you find that you will be told that in the Great Hall here, Oliver Cromwell's troops stabled their horses. It also happened down the road at, is it Chigwell? Down the road to Sussex, there's a little place there, you're shown the house where the horses. And then you go, when I'm there I usually say, well, he never was here. And they said, well, it was soldiers, and they must have been Cromwell's men. And therefore we blame it on Cromwell. But when I looked in this book, I did find one reference to Cromwell. Here is at Staunton Harold Church in Leicestershire. Sir Robert Shirley, 4th Baronet, must have been a very brave, if rather foolhardy young man. The splendid church he built in 1653, one of the very few erected between the outbreak of the Civil War and the Restoration, was an open act of defiance to Cromwell's Puritan regime, showing Sir Richard's identification with the High Church Anglicanism of martyred king and advertising his wealth, etc. And Cromwell is supposed to have put him into prison for doing it. Given that Cromwell was the man who resisted all Puritan demands for stopping the church collecting tithes, until a different form of funding was found to maintain the fabric of the churches and the ministers, since he defended the Catholic Church against the Quakers, the Anabaptists, the Fifth-day Monarchists, etc., the Presbyterians, in order to save the church, it's hardly likely he would have put somebody in prison for building a new one. And you find that the only source of that is a plaque, which was put up by one of his royalist relatives, this man's royalist relatives in the church. There's no reference to it anywhere else that I've been able to find, that event of him being put in prison for building the church. But you mustn't question, it was Hilaire Belloc who said, we must never, never doubt that which we're not sure about. And then I picked up a book, very odd, it's just called Thames. It's by Peter Ackroyd, who is full of invention. He has Charles Dickens building a wall across the marital bedroom. Weird things he does. But in this I thought, well, there may be somewhere on the Thames, because it's a biography in which he goes along and picks out places. And sure enough, he has a reference to Cromwell. What do we find? In 1646, Cromwell ordered the decapitation of the royalist soldiers who had defended the castle of Wallingford. Let the river have them, he is reported as saying, before they corrupt the land as the king corrupted England. This is put as a quote. Yeah. That seems pretty good evidence against Cromwell until you actually check the facts and find that the siege of Wallingford wasn't run by Cromwell, it was run by Sir Thomas Fairfax. That nobody died because when there was a breach made in the wall of the castle, they surrendered in accordance with the rules of law, because the rules of war at the time were, and right up to Wellington's time, that if you fought after a breach was made in the wall, and you continued to fight, then your life was forfeit. There was no quarter given there. And so they would have surrendered and marched out in good order, and nobody died there. Cromwell, at the time, we find from the diaries, well, happened to be in Yorkshire when he was decapitating these soldiers at Wallingford. But don't care, no, nobody's going to contradict him there. And then I came to the book by Winston Churchill, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Now I knew on an earlier reading of it that he had got a piece in about Cromwell through, this was about 16, let's stick with 1656, Cromwell had hundreds of Quakers thrown into prison. Now this is what Blake said. He said, a truth told with evil intent beats all the lies you can invent. In that year, there were large numbers of Quakers who were put into prison. Cromwell didn't have the right to put them in. He ran a system which had courts, and the courts could put them into prison if they had done something for which they could be charged. And what they were put into prison for, you find on checking, because that looked very odd. It's not the Cromwell that one knows if you read his letters and such, and his friends. They had a campaign, the Quakers had a campaign of going round to churches and disrupting the ceremonies when there were baptisms, weddings and funerals if they weren't being carried out in a manner of which they would approve. The result was there were fights, the constables arrested the Quakers, they were found guilty of breach of the peace, and because they wouldn't make an agreement that they would keep the peace, they were put into prison by the local magistrates. That becomes with Churchill, a rabid royalist, that Cromwell threw hundreds of Quakers into prison. This is what I mean by demonisation. If you see that, why would you doubt that Churchill was actually telling the truth there? Why would he lie? But then I went and looked at what happened when Cromwell really did something quite startling, was when he removed the Rump Parliament in 1653. On the 20th of April 1653, Cromwell went down to the Parliament where a few MPs were meeting, the few MPs that were left from an election in 1640, when the Long Parliament was elected, lasted all through the Civil War, and then 4 years after the Civil War it was still in being and would not call new elections. Because of course they were getting paid, they were enjoying themselves, they had great power, there were only a few of them, they could do what they liked, they were the law-making body of the country. And people were in desperation all across the country. How do we get this done? Cromwell marched down to the Parliament on that 20th of April with 30 musketeers, left them outside and went in, and then he said, "You are no Parliament, call the musketeers in," and they marched the members of Parliament out, and he locked the doors so they couldn't get back in. What does Churchill say? England had a master now. England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales knew who their master was. And he goes on in about 2 pages of rant about this dictator, tyrant Cromwell, who has removed democracy. And if you actually got bored with that and skipped a bit, you might miss the bit where he says, oh, and by the way, 2 months later, there was a new Parliament elected. So he's organised the removal of one Parliament which was staying beyond its welcome, and a new Parliament is elected. There was dancing in the streets in England. I was shown as a boy the place where the Maypole was put up in Wolverhampton for the celebrations. It was a bit early for May, but being the 20th of April, but it was that. Across the courts of Europe, you find records in the courts. Who is this man? Who is this man who has solved this problem in 5 minutes that other people haven't solved in 2 years? And we've now got a new Parliament elected in England. So Churchill tells the truth. He did go down, but he didn't make himself a tyrant. He simply, it was well after that, in the same year, that he was asked to take the role. He was actually asked to take the role of king, and he was made Lord Protector because they needed somebody who could guard the Constitution, like our present Queen does today. People say, what does the Queen do? She doesn't rule, she guards the Constitution. It's her job that if a Parliament went beyond its remit, she can close it down. If a Prime Minister breaks the rules, she can actually sack him. You don't think that. The only time she's done it is once, and that was nobody noticed, because everybody was happy. But it wasn't in England, it was in Australia. Yeah, thank you, back off it. Yeah, she did. He was removed. He was breaking the rules, she removes him, and everybody in Australia was happy, like they were when Cromwell removed the Parliament there. So that's what I mean by demonisation. These things which are said about him are never seem to be contradicted. By the time that I actually became interested in this enough to do something, because there's a limited amount that you can do, having taken on Shakespeare. The blind book, The Man Who Was Never Shakespeare, took 12 years. But this was in 2008. This book I saw reviewed in the Observer, and it was reviewed by an Irish, Gaelic Irishman, who said this book, which seemed to be pretty awful the way he was talking about it, he said he was too kind to Cromwell, this man said. Two things struck me, of course, that having a ranting book apparently, reviewed by another ranter, seems not the way a paper should operate. You know, you should try and get a fair review of it for readers, but he did catch one person to buy it. And the thing was, that was the picture on it. Let me put it up on the screen. This is the front of the book. There, the God's Execution. Oh, the colour hasn't come out very well on that. You can probably see it better on the book. Wonder why that hasn't. You really can't see how terrible it looks. But the odd thing was that this picture is nothing like Cromwell, of course. If you look at the actual official portraits, these are portraits which he had done officially, as he said, warts and all. He never had a moustache like that. That's Cromwell. His wart is very clear, it's not on the other one. And then another one which was done of him by
Excuse me, Tony.
Yes?
I wonder if you could stand to one side.
Thank you. Yes. What would I do without you? So there he is, warts and all. Nothing like the other one you'll see. No great moustache like that one. And there's another one of him, very similar, for a portrait. That's Cromwell. Where did this come from? It took me ages to find where this one had come from, because there are 30,000 pictures, derivative and original, of Cromwell on the web. You can get this one on the book is not among them, because it's so bad it hasn't been included. The only place I found it was with this man, the man who painted this in about 1860. He managed to paint a portrait of Wellington that made him look like a sissy. There. But here, even worse, we have this portrait picked from nowhere. Somebody must have been searched for to find something that would make Cromwell look so awful. But when you actually look at the original portrait, the colouring is nothing like this bright red. It has been made bright red, and he's dressed in russet in the original picture, and as I he is not doing, he looks as though he's glaring at somebody. Actually, in the picture, he's got a document in front of him. He's just turned, looking at somebody with his hand, and he's obviously explaining something. And it's just quite a gentle place. To doctor the picture on the front of the book, to this extent, suggests somebody who is really, really lost in the demonisation of this man. Well, when you got into the book, what you find is he's really criticising Cromwell over the siege at Drogheda. That's his starting point. How at Drogheda he massacred every man, woman and child in the place. Well, that is something where you would need a map of the town. And could I find a map of the town in the book? No, I couldn't. And you immediately are suspicious that there's something wrong. If you can see it, that, I haven't made it for that, but you can get the idea from that of what the picture actually looks like. It's not like Cromwell, but it's not either Cromwell looking absolutely ferocious there. But you've got, if you are writing a book like this, you've got to. So I had to go away and find a map of the town that he's talking about in order to understand the siege. And I saw this. I actually spent about 10 seconds looking at this map, and I knew the accounts of the siege of Drogheda were nonsense. See how long you take. Drogheda is a smallish town, 600 yards from top to bottom. And through the middle of it runs the River Boyne. And here is a bridge over the River Boyne. That is the only bridge over the River Boyne for 8 miles on either side. And the River Boyne is impassable. So Cromwell is on the south, and he cannot get round to the north. So there are gates on the south, 1, 2, 3, all defended by an army, not a garrison. 1/3 of all the royalist troops in Ireland were in that town when Cromwell got there, under a general, a commander, Arthur Ashton, who had fought in the wars of religion, the 30-Year War. He had fought in that. These were trained men, highly trained, not some rough garrison. Cromwell is on the south here. This shows the gates open, but of course they were locked. When he was there, they were defended by artillery, by cavalry, and by 3,000 trained soldiers. The gates on the north, of course, were open, because Cromwell, there was nobody there, Cromwell couldn't get over to there, so those were open there. Cromwell arrives and immediately tries to negotiate a surrender, on the basis that if he has to storm the town, then if he gets in, rules of war are the garrison, this army, is forfeit. There. After a week of negotiating, trying to persuade, he starts bombarding on the south of the town. He starts bombarding on the morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th of September of 1649. At 5 o'clock in the evening, 9 hours later, a breach is made in the wall, big enough for his troops to get through. At this point, he invites a surrender. This is refused. Arthur Ashton says, he who can take Drogheda can take hell. Well, he met Cromwell. And so Cromwell's men started to fight their way in. 2 hours later, at 7 o'clock, his men get into the town and they defeat. And actually, Cromwell thinks they have killed the whole of the garrison. But the question that you have to answer is this. When he started bombarding at 8 o'clock in the morning, do you think that women with children in the town might have had some thought, since it was only 400 yards from any point in the town to one of these gates, That's the distance. And if they crawled on their hands and knees, they would have still got out of the town by 7 o'clock in the evening. How long is it going to take a sensible scholar to work out that there was no women and children in the town at 7 o'clock? Yeah? There were no civilians in the town. The only person I've ever seen write that is Simon Sharma, and he does it sort of en passant, so he doesn't get into trouble, for mentioning the fact that the stories about the siege of Drogheda are total nonsense. But that isn't the only evidence. That isn't the only evidence that there were no civilians in the town. Because at 9 o'clock, some soldiers are reported going into the house of the previous governor, who was Lord Moore. He was the previous governor to Ashton. And they go into his house because they think a fugitive has got him there. And when they get in, they find Lord Moore sitting down at dinner with his wife. Where was Lord Moore during all this while they were killing all the civilians? Outside the north gates, of course, waiting for it all to finish and then going back in. Because it took about an hour for Cromwell's men to clear the town. So there's no trace of anybody identified who was killed, civilian killed. And Cromwell then wrote a total report of all the people who were killed, the soldiers who were killed. They died starting from the commander right down. They were all listed and sent back to Parliament there, the whole lot. And he thought he'd got everybody. But then he didn't know that the governor of Kilkenny, which was the nearest royalist town to Drogheda, had written to the Duke of Ormond, Charles Stuart's regent in Ireland. He'd written to Ormond and had said, "What do I do with all these men who have come into me from Drogheda, some from every regiment?" Well, if the soldiers could get out through the doors in the north, so that I reckon that about 1,000 soldiers got out, sensible fellas, and went to Kilkenny. So Cromwell's report was wrong in that sense. We know the letter. We know the letter, that document that Cromwell wrote, because Thomas Carlyle produced it in a collection of Cromwell's correspondence and reports. And then Carlyle was furious because he found that somebody had got into the documents and had forged an edition under Cromwell's report. And they had forged the words, "and many inhabitants." And that is what is printed. Whenever you see this report printed, that's what you see. "And many inhabitants," as though Cromwell put that. But you can see, just looking at it, that it's a forgery. So this is, as I said, this is what you're up against. And this is the picture of Cromwell in the town that goes round. It's read, it's provided to schools. There he is, riding through the town. Very clever. You identify him by putting a Puritan, you don't give him a shield and an helmet. You put a Puritan hat on his head. And there's the soldiers killing the women and children in the town. That was written in 1868, a standard textbook in Southern Irish schools. This stuff is taught in Southern Irish schools at Key Stage 3, the last document I saw. So, what does somebody say about this? First of all, they said it was worse than somebody wrote that this was worse than any siege, the death toll, than any in the 30 Years' War. How about Magdeburg? They didn't surrender at Magdeburg, 30,000 civilians died, but this was worse than that. And then somebody else, he's got in here a quote which says, "What happened at Drogheda was worse than what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki." At those towns, what happened? You have a civilian population there, totally unsuspecting, and a tremendous weapon is dropped upon them. Here we have a week of negotiations, we have 11 hours before they get in, and this is like dropping an atom bomb on them and killing, I don't know how many died, but it was in the tens of thousands, if not more. The same thing was the story at Wexford. And we know what happened at Wexford because Cromwell wrote to the Parliament and said, sadly we will not be able to use Wexford as winter quarters for my troops, because when the civilians left, they took all the cooking utensils with them. Again, there were no civilians in Wexford when Cromwell got in. But one gentleman, this was in 1883, he was writing, he wrote this, what happened at the siege of Wexford? Well, this is what he says. When the usurper, it's interesting, the usurper, Cromwell wasn't even chief of the army at the time. When the usurper entered the town of Wexford, 300 women of the best rank and fashion fled to the cross in the marketplace, which was actually the place that the defenders had chosen to set up their main defence against Cromwell, which is the obvious place for any innocent female to run to in the middle of the battle. Yeah. Oliver, to manifest himself as a thorough paid bloodhound, encompassed them with his merciless dragoons, and having no regard for their sex or innocency, caused them all to be butchered, not one being suffered to escape. If anybody believes that, then they'll believe anything. To quote the words of Duke of Wellington. But they do. In a book called Going to the War, which has been well reviewed by a colonel in the army, Charles Carleton, he repeats this story, but he makes it slightly better by making 200 women of the better sort that rushed into the marketplace and they'd be killed. Yeah. So it still goes on. If you want to blacken Cromwell, he does it all the way through. At the siege of Winchester, he talks about how a woman was killed by one of the soldiers. There was a woman killed. She was actually, Cromwell gave all the women the right to take their children out before he started bombarding even at Winchester. They could all leave. They didn't. A number of them stayed and they fought. They fought with the men. And this woman got hit on the head by a gun, butt of a gun, and she died because she was fighting with men. What were the men in the midst of a battle? Winchester had withstood a siege for ages. In the midst of a battle, she got hit because she was fighting the soldiers. It's sad, but it doesn't reflect on Cromwell one jot. So, where did this come from? All this demonisation of it? Well, oddly, can you see me all right? Yeah. Oddly, it came from both sides of the spectrum. The Royalists blamed Cromwell, quite rightly, because he had been responsible for the Royalists losing the Civil War. It isn't that they would have won the Civil War if he hadn't been there, but they wouldn't probably have lost. It was Cromwell who organised, starting from nothing, no military experience, organised the cavalry, troops of cavalry who defeated the Royalist cavalry, which was supposed to be the best. Then he developed the model army. And the handbook of the British Army says that it was not until 1906 that the British Army got back to anything like the efficiency which it had under Oliver Cromwell. If it hadn't been for Oliver Cromwell, the Royalists wouldn't have won, but they wouldn't have lost. It would have just dragged on, and eventually everybody would have got worn out, and the King King Charles would have probably come back. But Cromwell never lost a battle through the whole of the Civil War and beyond. Even outnumbered at Dunbar by about 3 to 1, he beat the Scots. who had the better position. So this man was blamed for that, quite right. But the other thing was, he was blamed, he was actually blamed by the church. Each of the churches blamed him for not letting them get the upper hand. He held the ring. He would not let somebody take over when people didn't want it. But there were a group in the army who were called the Levellers. It was a nickname given to them because they wanted to have everybody equal. Not a bad aim, it isn't that I'm against the political aim, but the way in which they went about it was they appointed agitators in every regiment whose purpose was to cause mutiny in the army. Even before the war was won, these people were operative, trying to cause mutiny. The idea of the Levellers was that if they actually managed to take over the army, they could then take over the country and have their policies enforced. But what Cromwell knew, and you would know, is that if that had happened, all that would have happened, the people would have turned to the Royalists, and the Royalists would come back. They wouldn't have supported the Levellers in that situation. Cromwell held the ring, and that was his problem. He did that, and so he got hated from all sides. And the Levellers hated Cromwell. And the oddest thing was, when he was Lord Protector, only one attempt was made on his life. Which is very odd, because every Sunday morning he was known to walk out in Hyde Park with his family, with no escort, no guard. He would just walk through town. The Loyalists had an agreement with the Levellers. Because what they thought was, if they get rid of Oliver Cromwell, they can have a fight between themselves and they'll see who takes over if they do that. And the idea was that the horseman would ride through the park, because he didn't get too close to Oliver Cromwell, he'd ride through the park, shoot him down, and then escape through a gate where they'd taken the edges off and escape through this gate. That was all planned for this Sunday morning, and sadly, when they got up, the horse had got a cold. And it never happened, and they never arranged it again there. But you know, it's interesting how this happened, two sides wanting to have a go at each other. And it's happened in many countries that there were people more concerned about that than actually getting things working there. But what they celebrate, every year in Burford, they have a celebration at which they demonise the name of Oliver Cromwell because he shot down the Levellers. What actually happened is quite different from the story you get there. There were a number of mutinies that did happen but settled peacefully. But there was one particularly big one where three groups of mutineers were coming together in Oxfordshire, one from Northamptonshire and one from Wiltshire, and one who were at Wantage, one group at Wantage. So we're quite local. Fairfax went to Andover, ready to try and talk the people out of it, and there he called Cromwell to him. Fairfax was the commander-in-chief. You have to remember this, because they try and blot him out, he's airbrushed out. Cromwell is sent for, and he asked Cromwell to go down to Salisbury and see if he can talk the mutineers down. He goes down, he finds their grievances are that they are going to be forced to go to Ireland, and they hated the thought of fighting the Irish, because they were supposed not to obey the Geneva Convention. But they were terrified, don't want to do that. And Cromwell pointed out that he would only take volunteers. He'd been appointed commander in Ireland. He would only take volunteers. And the other thing was they weren't going to get their back pay. And he told them that the army had not only approved their back pay, but it was on the way to them. At that, the mutiny at Salisbury collapsed. He then pardoned them, gave them pardon, and that was the end of that. When he got back to Andover, Fairfax had sent to the captain there, Captain William Thompson, who was the chief agitator, who had organised all this, obviously a reasonable organiser, and he had told him to stay where he was in Wantage. They'd already forfeited their lives as mutineers, but stay at Wantage. He would come unarmed and he would talk to them of their problems, discuss their problems. On his way with Cromwell to Wantage, they found that he had left wanted. He'd just broken a direct order, disobeyed a direct order, and he'd gone to Burford. Fairfax asked Cromwell to go and arrest them. He took his troopers, and in one of the most amazing rides, which actually gets people worried about where Burford and Andover were, because he was there seemed to be there so fast. At midnight, he gets there, they're all asleep. There are a few shots fired, but he arrests them. The only person who escapes is Captain William Thompson. This man has got them into this situation, and he's off like a rocket, leaving behind not only all the mutineers, but his kid brother as well, there to face the music. Fairfax arrives in the morning. Oh, Cromwell corrals them all in the local church, and you should see what they write about that. How dare he coral them in the church? What a thing to do! You know, how uncivilised. It's quite weird. But anyway, puts them in the church, so she's got them. And in the morning, Fairfax arrives. He court-martials all of them, and they are all condemned to death. Cromwell points out that all of them, apart from the agitators, had been misled. They had been misled into the mutiny, and he talked him out of killing all of them, persuading him he should only execute the 3 agitators. And that's what happened. 3 people were killed. 3 people were shot. So, Thompson fled, and he was followed by some troopers. He ambushed them, he shot 2 of them, and they in turn shot him. That becomes, in Churchill's book, Cromwell had him shot down like a dog. Now, quite weird. Here we have a man who shoots down 2 of his fellows, they shoot him, and Cromwell has to be responsible for it. And this is how the whole story runs through. And if you go to Burford, you will find all their material. People go there, they're mainly people who deal with energy, they have grievances of some sort, and they arrive there in great part, sort of, Hadley Wedgwood, Ben was there on one occasion. They're all there, and you read the material, and the name of Thomas Fairfax doesn't occur once. It's Cromwell did this, and Cromwell did that, and Cromwell had these men shot. You'd think he shot them with his own gun, to look at this, and it's Cromwell. And they, of course, Churchill describes Thompson as probably the first martyr for democracy. Well, you have to be a funny man. So now you see why I call this the demonisation of Cromwell. Because that's what's happened. This great man, who I believe, I didn't when I started, I didn't think of him as the greatest of Britain when I started. I do now, when I think what might have happened had he not been there and able to do that. He is criticised because he didn't set up a parliamentary government. It actually took 70 years before there was a parliamentary government in Britain that was actually working under Robert Walpole. It isn't easy to do. If you think about, you know, there was no communications, people were not educated, and he managed to hold the whole thing together. And I give you Oliver Cromwell. Thank you.
Tony, that was absolutely superb as usual. His research is so rigorous, it's breathtaking. I don't know whether you all know that in real life, Tony is a nuclear physicist, but he has a lot of other interests, as you have gathered. And when he puts his mind to something, he doesn't stop until he's got everything that he thinks is available on the subject. Would you like to take a couple of questions?
Oh, you're visibly grateful, yes.
Right. Do we have a question? Tony?
Okay. Have you tried writing to or communicating with some of these errant sources and pointing out their ways? And if so, what kind of reaction?
Well, most of the people I'm quoting are in fact deceased here. But that was the only book. I did try and get in touch. There was no address for this man who wrote this book, and I wrote to the publisher and asked, you know, if I could get in contact with him. I had no reply, and I did it with somebody else who's written the book, and I got no reply. It's obvious they may have heard of me.
Sorry, can I ask, did
Yeah.
Cromwell, were 52,000 Irish women and children sold into slavery in the West Indies?
Yes. So when?
In the 10 years after Cromwell invaded?
Yeah. I think it is true that after he left, because he left at the beginning in the May of 1650, he had nothing else to do with Ireland after that.
Was his son-in-law in charge?
Sorry?
Was his son-in-law in charge after he left? Or was he still in charge of the of Britain after he left?
No, because there was a parliament. The parliament is the law-making body, and Cromwell only became the Lord Protector in 1653. I know what happens. I mean, you read the book, it's all the Cromwellian troops. It was the Cromwellian clearance. It was the Cromwellian this. It was the Cromwellian that. He wasn't there. He wasn't the person who made the laws. And in fact, a lot of what was done. It was organised before I either went or after he left. I mean, yes, I think what happened in Ireland over a period of time was, in fact, pretty awful when you see that. But to say, oh, we'll pick one man like they do at Burford, we will ignore what was actually happening. When Cromwell was Lord Protector, he was not ruling the country as a monarch, an absolute monarch. The Parliament passed the laws. And I'll give you an example of the sort of thing that happened. When in 1657, there was a man called John Naylor who went to Bristol on Palm Sunday, and he rode into the town on an ass, emulating Jesus, with the women throwing palms under the ass's hooves. And he was arrested for blasphemy. And Parliament took over the case, and they spent weeks actually mulling over what to do with this man who had dared to ride into Bristol on an ass. And Cromwell could do nothing about it because Parliament was the sovereign body in the country. And what he did do was he reinstituted the House of Lords as a reviewing body. He had voted for the retention of the House of Lords in the March of 49 when it was abolished. He didn't want it abolished. He believed that there should be a reviewing body. And so he reinstituted it as a reviewing body. He created the first life peers to do so that they could control Parliament, or at least delay things in Parliament. This he did. And that was the situation. Like today, Parliament is the dominant body, the supreme law-making body. The Queen is not. You don't say Queen Elizabeth has done this and Queen Elizabeth has done that. You actually know that it's Parliament that passes the laws here in the country. The House of Lords cannot stop most of them. And it'll be a tragedy for this country if they do go to an elected House of Lords, because we get the sort of mess they had in America with two layers of people thinking they can make the law. In America it's three, and we saw what happened with their financial crisis. I just make that on pass on that he was much better at politics than most people. He was not in charge of what happened in Ireland at that time. And it has to be remembered the person who started the many of those Irish problems was not the parliamentarians, it was James I, who did the settlements in Ireland of the Scots. So when you look at it, it's a most complicated problem, but just to say, oh, let's pick on Cromwell and call the troops Cromwellian troops and call the actions Cromwellian actions, when he's nothing, he had no finger in any of those pies.
Yeah, we have a question here from John.
Yeah?
Yes, I've had a work colleague whose name was Lloyd Griffiths, and he discovered that his wife through the female line was connected with Oliver Cromwell, and consequently he changed his name to Lloyd Cromwell Griffiths. Is this? Do you know anything about this? The
Welsh connection.
Pardon?
The Welsh connection.
No, the fact that the surname Cromwell goes through the female line instead of the male line.
Well, what happened was his great grandfather was named Ap William.
Sorry, was name what?
Ap William, which means son of William.
Right.
But he was an Ap William. And then his sister married Thomas Cromwell. So at the next generation, the family changed its name to Cromwell, which they thought was possibly more recognisable than William. And so it was from there that the name Cromwell went through the sister of of his great grandfather.
Why is there the tradition that it passes down a female line then?
Oh, well, it didn't. It was just that it's like nobody recognises you if you're named Williams, but they will recognise you if your name name is the same as Thomas Cromwell.
So it was a way of eradicating the fact that you were connected with Cromwell.
No. It was simply that he wanted a name which was recognisable. He wanted a name which was recognisable. Thomas Cromwell was famous, so he takes the name Cromwell. So you become get a name which is rather more memorable than Williams. It was as simple as that. And one of the problems that's come out of that is that when people go round and they will see a monastery that is destroyed, they say Cromwell did that. But it wasn't this Cromwell, it was the Thomas Cromwell who did it. And in fact, I will give the reviewer of the book in The Observer did say that it's amazing how around the country Oliver Cromwell gets blamed for damaging things which were damaged a century before him.
But is my colleague correct in assuming that name, Cromwell Griffiths, through the female line to this day? Is that something that's still going?
No, he was just Pinch. He just Pinch. He changed his name. It's amazing when you go back in time, even into the 19th century, how many people actually would have two names. They'd be known by two different names. And so it was quite normal for somebody, because there was no registration. So if you wanted to change your name, you would have. I saw once something saying, Mr. X, aka Mr. Y, aka Mr. Z, and they just used these names where it was convenient to use them, especially if they were good. You not got some time left?
That sounds like a signal to me.
Sorry, not.
You've got one more question?
Yeah.
Just one.
When I was a kid many years ago, there was an old musical song. I'm one of the ruins that Cromwell knocked about. That referred